So I'm just going to quickly thank everyone for joining us. We are going to start the webinar shortly. And as mentioned before, it's a webinar to talk about the changes to Bill C-65 and the workplace harassment and violence prevention regulations. But before we do that, I'm just going to do a couple of quick introductions. On the right there, maybe, or my right anyways. Martha, do you want to just maybe give a wave and say hi? Martha Johnson, she's a regional rep in Winnipeg, and she'll be the voice potentially behind the scenes that you might hear about later.
Hi guys.
My name is Tracy Thor, and I'm going to be one of your kind of hosts tonight, I suppose. And I'm from the Winnipeg Regional Office. And I'll introduce Marianne and Clint in a little bit later. They're going to have some opening remarks and presentation. But so just quickly, I've been speaking about this as we've been waiting, but of course, just so that we have it, if you're having any questions about some of the functions of webinar, there's the orange arrow that will show your sort of like a taskbar or your control panel, where it will allow you to ask some questions. Everyone is muted, and we will ask that when you're kind of finished at the end of the call here today, we ask that you stay on the line because you're going to get a real quick little survey. It's about 3 questions. We'd really appreciate if you would answer those questions. It's just going to help provide some feedback for us. So we'll remind you again a little bit later. If you're wanting to know, today's webinar is being recorded, and it's going to be available later on. So for those folks, if you find that some really good information and you may not catch it all, it will be recorded. You can go back to it, and you can also share it in your workplace. So I think what I'm going to do to get started is I'm just going to do a land acknowledgement, and then we will move on to introduce Marianne. So because we're virtual, and I recognize that we're in the prairies, right? This webinar is being participated in from folks across the Prairie region. So there are many Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose territories are within the Prairie region. So we encourage each of you on your own to research your own area in the spirit of reconciliation and become aware of the peoples of whose land that you're a part of. So, and I'm in Winnipeg. Marianne, Clint, and Martha are also all in Winnipeg. We're hosting from Winnipeg. So I acknowledge that I live and work in Treaty 1 territory, and that's the land of the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So I am dedicated to ensuring that the spirit of reconciliation and Treaty 1 is honored and respected, and that we respect the treaties that were made on these territories, acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past, and dedicate myself to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So that being said, like we asked, take a moment to acknowledge the territory and the land that you are part of. So I'm going to go next to Marianne Haldoon. Marianne Haldoon is our Regional Executive Vice President for the Prairie region. And so I will just let her have a few minutes for some opening remarks. Marianne?
Great. Thanks, Tracy. So I want to welcome everyone. Great picture, Clint. That was from the last National Health and Safety Conference with all the Prairies delegates, for those that are able to see the screen. I want to welcome everyone. We did a lot of health and safety webinars last year when the lockdown first started, because right now in the situation that we're in, health and safety is paramount, and having new legislation come in when we can't do training in our regional offices, in our boardrooms, is something that we can't wait on. And so I want to thank Clint, who is usually first and foremost, across the regions to get training prepared and delivered. I know it probably won't answer all of your questions, but there have been some significant changes to the legislation and how that needs to be applied in your workplaces. I will say that every department at the federal level, I know, needs to revise their policies. And that's something that I'm sure your components are doing for those that are in a component structure. But this is really good information for you to know what questions to ask, and just to give you a base of information. And, you know, if there is a need to dive into it a little bit further, I'm sure Clint absolutely will. So I want to thank him for taking the time to put this together. And of course, Martha and Tracy for facilitating. And I look forward to the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Marianne. And next, we're going to move on to Clint. Clint Worth is our regional health and safety rep, which if you've joined any of our health and safety related webinars, you will know this by now. So I'm going to hand it over to Clint. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tracy and Marianne. So usually when I do these webinars, inherently my workload increases, which I welcome. You know, lots of questions come out of, you know, the discussion topic that we'll be having today. So lots of questions already that I've been facing around the new legislation, what it's going to look like, when it's going to roll out, how it's going to roll out, all those sorts of things. So just as a bit of background information, this is something that myself and the PSAC representatives have been working on for about 3 years. So for the first time in a long time, the federal government came to us and asked our opinion on, you know, what we wanted to see changed in the violence prevention legislation. So really good opportunity to sit down with labor programs, with consultation meetings, to share ideas. I was able to share a lot of the feedback that I was getting from locals. So for example, if I was hearing from a USJE local where they were having trouble picking a competent person, that sort of information I was able to take back to labor programs. And you'll see when we go through the information, how that's been captured in this new language. Also, some really good examples coming out from workplaces and locals around really crummy reports from the investigators that were basically useless in the workplace. So we took that sort of information and feedback, and now there's all sorts of increased wording around requirements of what has to be in an investigator's report and what specifically the employer has to do. So all that was, you know, was captured, and for the first time in a long time, I really feel like this government was actively listening to what we were asking for and what we were telling them, and the feedback that we were providing. So this, you know, this new language has come out after, you know, after a long lot of work going on. One of the key things I want to note too is this language came into effect January 1st, 2021. So this will apply to all new cases that are coming forward, you know, from this point. If there was a harassment or a violent incident that happened in 2020 or prior, it will be adjudicated and resolved through the former process. So if you have a gray area, you know, maybe the harassment or bullying is carried over to 2021, my recommendation would be follow the 2021 language and then have the employer or somebody else tell you that it doesn't apply. Because I like the 2021 language so much more as we go through the material. So what we'll be doing in the course of, you know, about my half-hour presentation kind of thing, we'll go over some of the basics of Bill C-65, some of the important things that have come out through this. We'll talk about how the 3 pillars of prevention, response, and support have been more clearly identified, more clearly articulated to employees and employers. I will talk a little bit about some of the resources that we have available to clearly identify, you know, the interpretations. We'll talk about some of the training that PSAC is going to be offering, and then some of the things that I can offer right now, such as the IPG, the interpretations, protocols and guidelines, and then there's a flow chart, those sorts of things. We'll go through a bit of a Q&A where I'll do my best to answer some of the questions that'll come forward. And then just a reminder that we've got a quick little survey at the end of the webinar. If you can stick around, answer those 3 or 4 questions, it's going to be really helpful for us going forward.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think it's time for a quick poll here, Clint. So I'm going to launch a poll. The poll itself will be up in a minute. There we go. So those of you who are on the phone, you can't unfortunately see the poll, but the poll is, what level of knowledge do you have about Bill C-65 and the new workplace harassment and violence prevention regulations? So the first one is, I'm very familiar with these upcoming changes. Next is, I'm somewhat familiar with the upcoming changes. The third one is, I'm aware of but don't know much about it. And the fourth is, there are upcoming changes, question mark. And so I'll just give you a few more seconds here to vote. I can see that the votes are still coming in and how many people have participated. So I'll just give you a little bit of time because I know you don't want to miss out on the one poll that we're doing. And also, I'm just going to make a quick mention. There's been a couple of questions in the question box for those that have asked. There will be some resources that are sent out after to all the participants. So just to let you know that that will be available. And again, the webinar is recorded, so you will have the opportunity there as well.
Yeah, so it'll be, so in a few days, once we've had the opportunity to edit the recording as well as all the resources and materials provided in the handout section, they'll be available online by going to psacprairies.ca.
Okay, so almost everyone has voted so far. And of course, as soon as I say that, 2 more people vote. So I'm going to give you another 3 seconds here, and I'm going to close the poll. And here are the results.
Okay, so that tells me, some people are, the majority of the people are aware of what's coming, or don't feel that they have any knowledge at all, which is fine, because what we're doing tonight is we're going to, hopefully give you a little better understanding of what's going on, and we'll talk about some of the other opportunities to expand your knowledge base, even beyond this short webinar that we'll be doing tonight. So the first thing I want to look at is the definition. Let's start with that. So the new definition is any action, conduct, or comment, including a sexual nature, that can be reasonably expected to cause offense, humiliation, or other physical or psychological injury or illness to an employee, including any prescribed action, conduct, or comment. So I'm not going to go through the old definition necessarily, but it's really good to really clarify where some of the thought processes have advanced, where the new definition really is a lot clearer and a lot broader, and I think it's going to create a little bit of a conversation in the workplace. So even if you look at the old language, it refers to harm, injury, or illness. The new definition refers to offense, humiliation, or injury or illness. So it really broadens, the starting point for our conversation. If somebody takes offense to a comment, or somebody is humiliated by a comment, that's the start of the discussion for the workplace violence prevention policies and procedures to come into place. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I've got some experience through case history and things like that with the old language. It'll be really interesting to see what holds true for the new language, because it's really, if putting on my employer hat, if I'm an employer, I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I do with this kind of thing? How many investigations am I going to have to do? Those sorts of things. My response to that would be, if I put my union hat back on, is we're looking at prevention here. What we want to do is prevent any violence or harassment in the workplace at the starting point, at that base level. So we don't have to do investigations. We don't have to look at how we apply policies. We don't look at how we cope with somebody that's been injured in the workplace because of violence in the workplace. We want to look at those first steps and take those first steps into consideration and address those first steps before we get into something that's harder to manage, harder to fix, and often more costly. And then a couple quotes that I like using when I go through this material, especially for those that have attended the 2-day course that I've done on the old language. It's worth sharing here. So the first quote is from Bernice Fields. Violence in the workplace begins long before fists fly or lethal weapons extinguish lives. Where resentment and aggression routinely displace cooperation and communication, violence has occurred. And Bernice Fields was an arbitrator for some cases involving the United States Postal Service. So going back to 2000, the whole derogatory comment around going postal, around that time that was a really, concerning subject in that workplace. That was something that the arbitrator said. And then even looking at some Canadian examples, we recommend that workplace violence be defined not only as physical violence, but also as psychological violence, such as bullying, mobbing, teasing, ridicule, those sorts of things. And this came from the OC Transpo inquest. There was an active shooter situation in OC Transpo, the Ottawa bus service, transit service. And then one of the things that came out of that was this recommendation. And that really started forming our new thought process around what exactly violence is and where it originates from. And that's going all the way back to 2000. Makes me feel really old when I say all the way back to 2000, but that's the reality. It's been on the books and a thought process for over 20 years. Why is it important? So some of the research and statistics and maybe even common sense, show that incidents of harassment and violence escalate when they aren't addressed. I'm imagining in a lot of our workplaces, we see, if an issue doesn't get addressed, then it continues, it progresses. Other people think they can get away with the same sort of behavior, and it gets a lot harder to manage. And then the counter side to that, when there's an emphasis on prevention of workplace harassment and violence, there's a decline in the number of incidences over time. There's a value in dealing with things on the prevention angle. Workplace harassment and violence makes people sick, and it makes them sicker for longer. Some of the recent numbers I've seen, half of all sick leave taken is related to psychological injuries and mental health. And you could, expropriate from that a lot of that is probably tied to the workplace as well, if they're calling in sick. What I've noticed when I've been helping people out deal with their mental health issues through WCB, through supporting them through what's going on in the local, they're sicker for longer. If somebody's been violently assaulted in the workplace, their physical injuries heal a lot quicker than those psychological injuries that can last for years. And then the scenario I always refer to is if somebody breaks their leg, they get help right away. People understand what a broken leg means for a return to workplace, those sorts of things. Psychological injuries, a lot harder to get the needed support from a psychiatrist or a psychologist specialist, and a lot less understanding of that invisible injury. Statistics show that incidents of harassment and violence are increasing. And it's not just an awareness thing. It's something that's getting worse and worse in our workplaces. And then what a lot of people probably noticed as well, that many instances of harassment and violence, they don't go reported for a number of different reasons. Maybe it's the supervisor or manager that's creating the harassing and violent workplace, and they don't want to bring it forward because management's going to protect management and they're not going to hear their concerns. Those sorts of things. I've heard people say that, there's a whole aspect of confidentiality that's a real concern. So those are all issues, why people might not report, which are very reasonable. And then also racialized, Indigenous, and LGBTQ+ workers are at a higher risk of workplace harassment and violence. So we really need to consider that as well. One of the key things we want to focus in on, as I was saying at the outset when we looked at the agenda, is what we want to do is focus on the prevention. If we focus on the prevention and having a clear understanding right from the get-go, it'll make everything else so much easier as we go along. So part of that prevention strategy has to include the Health and Safety Committee. And there's a few points there where the Health and Safety Committee or the Joint Committee or the Health and Safety Representative, depending on the size of the workplace and the nature of the issue, they're required to be involved. It's not a situation where the committee is notified what's going on. The committee has to be and is required to be involved in the planning of certain things, such as developing the prevention policy itself. That might fall to the policy committee. Conducting workplace harassment and violence risk assessments and developing implementation strategies. So they're involved in the assessing of the violence and the harassment that's going on in the workplace and coming up with strategies to prevent it from happening again. They'll address circumstances external to the workplace, including domestic violence. This is a new concept that wasn't clear in the old language, but is in the new language, where there's an obligation for the employer to consider domestic violence in their harassment and violence policies. They have to have a plan for protecting people, for educating people, and supporting people that are facing domestic violence issues. They need to create and post emergency procedures. We have, fire drills every year when we're in our workplaces. Do we have active shooter procedures that every person in that workplace knows about? And the committee also needs to be involved in the development and implementation of the prevention training. So I'll talk a little bit later about the training that's required. The committee has to, or the committee or representative or policy committee has to be involved in that development and implementation. And then the committee also has to consider recommendations that come out of harassment and violence investigations. So when that report comes back from the investigator, they consider those recommendations that were put forward and how they're going to be implemented in the workplace. Employers, they tend to think that they control everything when the legislation is clear that the Health and Safety Committee, Health and Safety representatives, the policy committees have a role in all of these aspects. So with the response system, I'll go through it. It's changed a little bit from the old language. The step one is the notification, and that can be done orally in writing. And if it's from a witnesses, they can do it anonymously. I've seen even some recent situations where cases have come forward and they want to bring it forward anonymously. The employer says, no, you have to put your name to it. That's not a requirement, especially and clearly outlined in the new language. And then the employer in that first step has the opportunity to resolve that issue. If the employee and employer get together, agree on the situation, and then they can go forward and resolve it. The second step is a new step where it's a negotiated resolution or conciliation. This is an opportunity for a conciliator or a mediator to come in and see if they can resolve the issues before it gets to an investigation. There's some pros and cons to that that I'll outline a little bit later. Key thing to note with step two is it's optional. If the employee that's affected, the primary person reporting wants to skip the step, they can skip the step and go right to the investigation. Step three is the investigation, and it must be conducted if requested by the principal party. The employer used to try and find all sorts of loopholes. The ACON decision with out of Saskatoon area, and I think that was with, what was that with, Marianne? Refresh my memory with that.
That was with CFIA with
yeah.
the ACON decision.
Yep. Yeah. So that a lot of things came out of that. The employer thought that they didn't have to investigate if they didn't want to. The language now is even more clear that there has to be an investigation if it can't be resolved, and the principal party wants it. One of the new parts of the new response steps is the report. I've seen some horrible reports that the employers paid tens of thousands of dollars for that's like 6 sentences and doesn't tell you anything. So now there's a clear set of guidelines that have to be included in any sort of investigation report. A description of the occurrence, conclusions, and recommendations. You'd think that'd be a no-brainer, but I've seen so many reports from investigators that don't include that basic information. And the last new step for the investigation process, an investigator can be selected or appointed by Labour Canada. Old language, there was a whole definition of competent person, employer appoints, employee gets to veto. That's kind of gone. A little bit later in the slides, I'll outline the concept of a list of investigators that can be consulted anytime there's an investigation that's needed. And at the completion, investigators' report is provided to all parties and the Health and Safety Committee. That wasn't, the inclusion of the Health and Safety Committee wasn't abundantly clear in the old language. It's even clearer in the new language. The Health and Safety Committee then gets to determine what recommendations will be implemented, and all joint recommendations that are agreed to at that committee level must be implemented by the employer. So one of the big changes, as I referred to in the last slide, is the selection of investigators. So an investigator must be seen to be impartial and competent. That remains. Agreed upon parties are selected from jointly developed roster. Joint rosters will be relied on where they exist. The parties will not have input. So when we're agreeing to a list of joint investigators, the health and safety must consider the competencies of the candidates, including related to equity and discrimination. There's a couple of things going on there that I'll address. First one is the creation of the list. Not entirely sure how a lot of workplaces are going to roll this out and this new requirement out. What I foresee happening is the PSAC, along with other unions in the federal public service and the employers, get together, come up with a list, and then that list is approved by either a policy committee or a workplace health and safety committee going forward. And then you can pick from those people, any of those people on the list. What the committees, may have to do is monitor that list. If you get a horrible report that's biased and doesn't illustrate any sort of competencies, the committee can pull that person off of that list. And then, especially when you're selecting the investigator, you really need to consider the equity and discrimination aspects. For example, if the harassment has to do where an Indigenous member is affected, that investigator should have specialized training on Indigenous issues related to the investigation. So they're well equipped to investigate that issue and are knowledgeable about those subject matters. Question that always comes up, and we'll cover it here. If the employer is not following these new steps in the regulation, the resolution process is to go through the internal complaint resolution process that's covered under 127.1 of the Canada Labour Code. And basic process of that is employee and employer try to resolve. If they can't resolve, it goes to the workplace committee or workplace health and safety representative. If that can't be resolved, then it goes to labor programs and the health and safety officer to pass a final adjudication where they can make a recommendation or they can order the employer to follow the new guidelines. So outlining some of the things that we like about these new regulations, and as I mentioned at the outset, there's quite a few things that I really like about the new regulations. First one is there's a designated recipient that receives health harassment and violence complaints. So the old language, it said you have to report to your employer. Obvious question then is, well, what if it's your employer that's harassing and committing those acts of violence? Where do you go? Each workplace has to have a designated recipient. Could be somebody in labor relations, for example, where those sorts of complaints go to outside of towards your direct supervisor that either might be, the person that's harassing, or they might not be in the best position to address any harassment and violence issues. There's increased wording around confidentiality of all parties protected, bringing concerns forward anonymously, those sorts of things. Clear timelines for resolution that I've outlined at the last point there. Distinct processes for occurrences involving a third party, such as dealing with the public or dealing with an angry client. The old language wasn't really clear on what to do if it was a customer or a client that was harassing. The language is much clearer on that. We've got a detailed interpretation policy and guideline. That's actually attached in your handouts, and that's what I'll refer to formulate a lot of my opinion going forward right now. It's 45 pages, but it's not that bad of a read, and it'll be really helpful to refer back to when questions come back in the workplace, because it's a guide for employees as well as employers on what they should be doing at this point. There's an obligation to implement agreed upon recommendations of the investigator. Imagine that, the old language, it wasn't required. So the committee could come up with all these great plans and take up these recommendations. The employer could say, no, we don't want to do that, and it dies. The wording there has been strengthened. There's also monthly status updates to all parties. And then what I was referring to in that previous point, clear timelines. So they have to let the person know within 7 days that they received the complaint. 45 days, they have to begin efforts to resolve the concern. A maximum 60 days to agree on the investigator, and 1 year for the process to be completed, from complaint to investigate, or complaint, mediation, investigation, report, implementation in the workplace. That all has to be completed within 1 year. And there's the ability for the employer to ask for extensions if they can validate that. And we'll see how that plays out. There's a few things we don't like about the new language. The big one for me is, especially in the IPG, the employer's decision prevails in joint matters if a decision cannot be reached. So in situations where the workplace committee or the health and safety representative can't come to an agreement on the recommendations, it defers to the employer's opinion. One of the big concerns I have with that is if we don't have strong committees, if we have employers that manipulate the decisions of the committee, it really shifts that balance of authority and decision-making in the employer's favor. There's a really vague statement around reasonably attempt to agree and record all incidences where agreement impossible. So that whole reasonably attempt to agree, it's really a vague area, and I think that's an area where the employer might, take advantage of that wording. And as we saw when the old language was first introduced, I anticipate there's going to be a lot of, bumps in the road as we go along with the implementation. Lots of questions, lots of ambiguity still. That isn't going to really come out until we see some cases go through the system to determine, the exact interpretation and application of this new legislation. I can also foresee employers pushing for conciliation and mediation, even if the employee that's complaining doesn't want it, and using that as an opportunity to delay those sorts of things. Generally speaking, my opinion would be, if you've got an employer that legitimately wants to resolve the issue and looks at this as an opportunity to fully flesh out what's going on with an open mind to resolve the issue at that mediation stage, we should go for that. If you've got an employer that is using it as a tactic to stall, is not taking the process seriously, then you might want to consider waiving that mediation stage and going right to the investigation stage. And then the employer could refuse to agree on implementing any recommendations as well. So going through all these great new legislative languages, all sorts of new additions, the employer at the end of the day, still has the ability to refuse on implementing any of the recommendations, which is really, a big one in my mind. So when we're talking about, what this new legislation is really good for, it's really good for a couple of reasons, but it also has some drawbacks. So the main value I see in going down this process is that it gets somebody from the outside of the organization looking at what's going on inside at an earlier level. So especially if you work for an employer like CBSA or corrections or RCMP, that have, historically had trouble dealing with harassment and violence in the workplace. It's not focused on giving the person their day in court. All of this language is with an eye to preventing it from learning from it and preventing it from happening again in a similar circumstance. So it doesn't really give the person their day in court. There's other processes for that I'll outline. The Human Rights Act and collective agreements prohibit harassment based on prohibited grounds of discrimination. And that can be included in any sort of wording of a grievance, for example. Workers' Compensation Act in all 3 provinces provides benefits to workers who suffer psychological injuries due to harassment and violence. There's some issues around that and some challenges around that I deal with on a daily basis. And if there's questions about that, we can cover them in the question and answer period. And I'm also working on getting a bit of one of the next webinars I'm looking at doing is a bit of ABCs of workers' compensation to give people an idea of, what's involved in a workers' compensation claim. If your local or your component should consider filing grievances, they could be based on human rights complaints or WCB claims if the employee is seeking reimbursement of leave, healthcare accommodation, or human rights damages, for example. And all these processes, workers' compensation grievance process, the investigation and response process outlined in this new legislation, they can all work in conjunction. They can work separately, they can work together, or they can work, subsequently all at the same time, where it might make sense, for example, to put a grievance in abeyance if you're expecting a recommendation to come from an investigator, for example. So all of these things can work in conjunction with each other to best meet the needs of the employee that's affected. Just one note, so just from the outset, if it wasn't clear, all these new changes apply to those working in the federal public service. For those that have friends and family and loved ones that work in under provincial legislations, there's similar legislation. If you Google Safe Work Manitoba, Saskatchewan, or Alberta, it's very easy to find the health and safety legislation around violence and harassment in the provincial setting. They're very similar wording, except when you come to the investigation process. The federal process where you have a competent person outside looking in is unique to the federal public service. One of the things I'm working on specifically with the Manitoba Federation of Labor is incorporating some of this new federal language and lobbying provincial governments to include some of this sorts of language in provincial legislations for our provincially legislated members as well, because even within the PSAC, we have a large number of members that fall under provincial legislation. And then, as I noted, one of the things I want to leave you with, even if I don't have it ready, I want to make sure that you're aware of things that are coming forward. So we'll have an updated PSAC toolkit for preventing harassment and violence. We've got an old toolkit, but we need to update it with the new language. There's the interpretation policy and guidelines document. That's part of your handouts. If you can't open up your handouts that are on probably the right-hand side of your interface, it'll be there. If not, don't worry about it. We're going to post it on the PSAC Prairie's website, within a few days. Labor Canada is also going to come out with some additional guides that'll be coming out. The fun one for a lot of local representatives is the employer-sponsored training. That has to be coming out and completed within the next 12 months. So each and every employee in the workplace has to be trained by the employer within the next 12 months. And for new employees, that has to be done by April 1st. So when the pandemic broke out, there was lots of discussion from the federal government about delaying this. They chose not to delay it. So those timelines are set. The employer has 1 year to offer training to each and every employee in that workplace. And I'm referring to training. I'm not referring to awareness. Like, I'm not talking about like a 15-minute slideshow presentation where you interact it with a little bit and Bob's your uncle, you're done. I'm talking about specific training. The new language in the legislation clearly outlines what kind of training is required in workplaces that the employer has to offer. And then even with our own education, one thing I always say when I do health and safety education is, if the employer was doing their job and doing their job well, the union wouldn't have to do this kind of training to the extent that we do. But because they don't, there's a definite need for us to do some education in certain areas. So the big education course that we'll be offering probably in the next month or two is a full 2-day course that'll be delivered online, going into more detail some of the topics that we've talked about in an interactive setting. And then it's a bit of and it's updating the language, updating that course that we've been offering for a number of years throughout the Prairie region. And then also what we want to do is get back to basics a little bit. So we'll also be offering a series of 4 90-minute interactive education modules. First one will be a very basic, exploring what is health and safety, why is it important in the workplaces, why is it a union responsibility, and then we're going to branch off into a couple different areas associated with that. We'll look at specifically the employer's duty to accommodate. We'll look at the roles and responsibilities of a health and safety committee or health and safety representative. And in the final 90-minute session that we'll be offering, we'll have to deal with looking specifically at the employer's obligation around training, around resolving issues, those sorts of things. So that's the meat and potatoes of the presentation that I have. I'll turn it over to Tracy and Martha if there's any questions.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to just give Clint a breather because most of these questions will be directed to him. So
yep, fair enough.
He can take a breather, have a drink.
I will do my best to answer them.
So yeah, just to let you know that we have quite a few people on the call. There are several questions. So Martha is going to direct those questions to Clint. We will keep everyone muted. So if you have any questions now that have not been answered by the presentation, or maybe you have more questions now that you've heard the presentation, you can certainly type those in, and there might be similar questions. So if your own question isn't read out exactly the same, it could be that we're grouping a couple of questions together because they're both very, very similar. So just to
and then just as a reminder too, it'll be a lot easier for me to answer generic questions. If you ask me like a specific question about your own workplace, a specific circumstance, it's going to be really hard for me to give an informed opinion if I don't have all the information, which is going to be really hard in this kind of setting, as well as the confidentiality aspect as well. We want to make sure that we're taking into consideration, the confidentiality with, 100 or so people on this call, that everybody doesn't need to know the specifics of who's involved and what's going on, kind of thing. So.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to now hand it over to Martha, and Martha, you can ask your questions of Clint, and we will go till about. We're going to answer as many questions as can. We're going to answer as many questions as we can. We'll go to about maybe around 8:15, if that sounds good, Clint.
Yeah, we'll see how we're doing for questions and those sorts of things. We're certainly not in a rush, but we certainly want to keep it concise and tight, so we're not losing people and people are still gathering value.
Okay, sounds good. Martha?
Okay. All right. Thanks, Tracy. I did do a quick scan, and most of the questions are definitely in the categories that you wanted, Clint, so that's good. So the first one we have is, are threat and gesture now considered to be a part of action, conduct, or comment?
Yeah. So when you looked at the definition there, those sorts of things like threats, even if it was verbal, even if the intent wasn't there, that's captured. So if the individual in the new language was offended, suffered humiliation, or there was an injury, and the broad interpretation of injury or illness, maybe they felt anxious, maybe they felt depressed, maybe they felt that they had to call in sick for work, those sorts of things. That has been already determined in the old language when we looked at harm, injury, or illness to be applicable, and that's going to be, in my understanding, the interpretation and the application in the new language as well. So even though there's not, when we use the word violence, we often think about, hitting, punching, throwing, swearing, those sorts of overt actions. What we don't think about often enough is those subtle threats, those innuendos, that persistent needling, harassing, belittling, mobbing behavior that is captured under that new definition and is considered harassment and violence in the workplace. So even looking back at the ACON decision, that was really a driver for a lot of these changes that you're seeing. So in the ACON decision, he complained about constant eye rolling from his supervisors. He complained about being excluded from conversations that they were supposed to be part of. He complained about an unfair marking of a certification exam. Those sorts of, constant, consistent belittling behavior. That was determined even in, 2015 to fit that old definition of harassment and would fit the new definition as well. So that's, in my mind, clearly established.
Okay, thank you. Oh, the next question is just a commentary first. Excellent. Change the definition of harassment. How do they define prescribed?
So there's a couple different documents that we refer to. The first one, yeah, because when you see the word prescribed, it's not clearly outlined in the legislation. That's why we refer to the IPG that outlines the prescribed steps. There's other areas that would define the prescribed steps as well. But when you're looking, from that perspective, the first place I'd start looking is that IPG. And then some of the other information that's going to come out from Labour Canada a little bit more once we have a better feel on the application of the new language. But my starting point for looking at that question is going to be that IPG. It's basically a list of questions and then how it should be applied. So prescribed training, for example. In that IPG, it clearly outlines what sort of training should be offered.
Thank you. Okay, the next one is a comment, and I guess, Clint, you can just confirm that this is correct. So the individual wrote, physical illness can be attributed to prolonged stress as well.
Yeah. So anytime there's a psychological injury, but there's physical aspects to it as well, right? And they don't have to be, they don't have to coexist in order for there to be a complaint under this new process. There doesn't have to be a physical aspect in order for a complaint to go forward. But yeah, that's certainly something you see, and certainly I see as well when dealing with people that need help.
All right. The next individual asks, I'm a little fuzzy on the risk assessments. What would this look like?
So yes, so there's a whole bunch of criteria that's outlined in the IPG, and a lot of and the assessment. They provide a lot of suggestions, but it also has to be tailored to the workplace. So because we have a lot of different sorts of workplaces that fall under the same legislation, that's why we defer to that workplace committee to determine what they need to assess. So for example, there might be some workplaces that deal with the public and clients coming in and out, like a Service Canada office. And we might have some workplaces that deal with offenders, like in corrections. The assessment tools and the risks and areas of increased risk are best determined by the people in the workplace that are ideally trained on how to spot those hazards, how to identify those hazards, and how to provide suggestions on how to resolve or limit and mitigate those hazards. So there's some guidelines in the IPG, but what we're really relying on is the committees or the health safety representative to provide clear direction for their own workplace, because they understand their workplace better than anybody else. And that's one of the great reasons why we need to strengthen our committees, is because they have the power to drive, what the assessment is involved in before you ever get to the investigation and follow-up stuff. So they should be involved right from the get-go. And that should be part of the training as well. So when we talk about employer training, if you've got a committee member that is like, I don't know what to do with this kind of stuff, part of that responsibility falls on the employer to ensure the people on that committee know how to do what they're supposed to do. And if there isn't, that training available to committee members, we need to make sure that it's available to them, so they do feel comfortable and confident in identifying what those risks are and how to address them and how to assess them.
Thanks, Clint. Okay, the next one is a fairly long question. Are those who may have observed an abusive interaction between two other individuals able to make reports? For example, a staff keeps making suggestions and asking questions about a colleague's use of the English language. This staff's language skills are not an issue. Plus, it doesn't seem appropriate to ask a third party about it. What category would this fit in?
So there's two parts to that response. So specifically around violence and harassment, there is the ability for people to file a complaint and start the process on their own as a witness, and again, that can be done anonymously. So even though you weren't directly affected, but you witnessed it, there's the ability for the employer obligation to start that process through an anonymous report. And then if you put your name to it, that's great as well, but that's not a requirement. So you don't have to put it in writing, you don't have to put your name to it, but there has to be some substance for the employer to look further into. Second part of that question, if we look specifically at the Canada Labour Code Part 2, and don't quote me on the section, but I'm going to say 126(1)(g), it refers to an employee's responsibility to report any health and safety risks in the workplace. So that could be violence and harassment and bullying. That's a health and safety risk in the workplace. There's an obligation that's unique to the federal language that requires employees to report and bring forward those types of concerns. Not enforced, per se, but it's certainly something that we can rely on. Say, hey, you know what? As an employee, you should be bringing this forward. This is why you should be bringing it forward. So yeah, absolutely. Even if you aren't directly affected, there's still the ability to start that process and start the employer's obligation to resolve it.
Thank you. The next person wants to know who is on the Health and Safety Committee and how are they appointed?
Okay, so yeah, so committee depends on the size of the workplace. They're appointed, elected, selected, delegated by the local themselves. So each local might do things differently. They might say, hey, we've got an open seat on the committee, and then it's the local's responsibility to fill that seat on the committee. Before that, at the creation of the committee, it's jointly decided the size of the committee. At least half of the members on that committee have to be employee representatives representing the unions and the workers that are affected in the workplace. So sometimes in some workplaces, you'll see both PSAC members and PIPS members involved. Then there has to be, in the creation of the committee, some discussion around there about, okay, how many seats does PSAC get? How many does PIPS get, based on the number of people, members in the workplace, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, the union decides who sits on that committee, represented employees. And it's up to the local and the component, by extension, how that process happens. They could appoint somebody, they could elect somebody, they could have votes at an AGM. Doesn't matter. The key point is the union decides who sits on that committee as an employee representative.
Thanks, Clint. Okay, so this, you can just add comment to this. This is a comment, but this individual has said there are departments that shut out all OH&S policy committees at regional and area levels. Their very new workplace committee is being deemed the policy committee. And then the same individual had a secondary comment that said, the process for the list at national for names is not working. So I don't know if you want to offer some comment on that.
Yeah, so maybe, especially with this one, it's addressing a couple different topics. I'll take my best stab at it, and then, like in the follow-up comments, if I didn't cover it clearly or you want to be more specific, ask away in the questions again, and we'll come back to it. So, especially for a lot of our workplaces, the makeup of the policy committee and the workplace committees should already be established. There should be, a set terms of reference, those sorts of things. If not, then that needs to be created jointly among the unions that are representing that workplace and the employer representatives. So again, the key point is the employer doesn't get to dictate the makeup. There's a consultation process as well there that in the case that's referenced should probably involve the component. And again, the component can resolve it however they want. I can provide, some support and those sorts of things to the component, but they have the ability to monitor and address their workplace issues as they see fit. It's one of the gray areas within my position within the PSAC. I'm constantly tight roping, so I try not to dip my toes into it too much. But if any component requests my assistance or guidance or opinion, I'll freely offer it. Or if a component comes to me and says, we need some training on this, what can you offer us? There's all sorts of training like around this topic, around other health safety topics I can assist with. I'm really hesitant about dipping my toes into the whole policy committee creation stuff without without directing the local or the component on what they should do or how it should be done or what they do, kind of thing. And then refresh my memory, Martha, about the second part of the question.
The second part of the question just mentioned that the process for the list at national for names is not working, and then they said that's terrific.
So I haven't seen the list yet that's being jointly developed. I know it's in the process, and I'm not sure how that's going to roll out to the locals, to the policy committees, those sorts of things. What I'm going to suggest, though, if it's not working, like if there's names on that list that the Health and Safety Committee or the Policy Committee or the Health Safety Representative don't agree with, maybe they've got some experience, they have the ability to recommend that they be removed from that list and not be accessed. There's a whole long vetting process going on. So what I would suggest, if there's concerns with the people on the list or how that list is created or where it's pulled from, I would refer the member that's asking to their component for further clarification on what's going on that aspect. So once the list is set, it's not like a set in stone kind of thing. It's flexible, and if there should be the ability to add names or take names off as needed.
Okay, and the next person says, just for a ballpark figure, how many complaints are there in a given year? For example, how big of a problem is this?
Okay, so the latest stats that we at PSAC did are going back a bit. So I think it was 2018 or something. One of the key things that we found, though, was, and I didn't really cover it in my presentation, was on the reporting and the increased reporting required by the employer. What we found was that the information that we were getting wasn't accurate because it wasn't capturing all those incidences that were resolved within the workplace. It was only capturing those incidences that were reported to labor programs because it was investigated by a competent person investigating. So we didn't really have a good idea, concrete on how pervasive the issue was, but we could certainly get anecdotal sense of how pervasive it was. Just from the amount of people that were coming forward and saying, it happened, but I didn't report it. That's what we, really have to flesh out. The new requirement for reporting on the employer is anytime there's a complaint coming forward, the employer has to document it, has to report it to labor programs so that we have a better idea of how pervasive the issue is, what exactly is going on in the workplace, and what the workplace is doing to resolve their issues. So I'm hoping with this new reporting procedure, we'll have a lot more clarity on exactly how much of an issue this is for, some of our workplaces. And that'll vary between workplace to workplace too, depending on the type of work that's being done. So that's the short answer there.
Thank you, Clint. Okay, the next one is, after an investigation was completed and the employer refuses to implement the recommendations, where do you go from there?
So what I'm going to suggest is the resolution process there is it cycles back to that 127.1, the internal complaint and resolution process, where it goes through the committee. If it doesn't, then it goes to the component to resolve. And then there's also the language there, if they can't come to any sort of conclusion, then it goes to the employer's discretion kind of thing. But if the committee recommends the recommendations put forward are implemented and the employer doesn't, my understanding and my interpretation would be that you could then use the internal complaint resolution process to resolve that.
Perfect. Okay, next question. Have there been any changes to disclosure and vetting of reports, Some of the previous harassment or violence investigation reports had so much redacted that it was difficult for complainants to respond, or OH&S committees to even do anything with them because so much was withheld.
Yeah, so that's, yeah, so balancing out the whole investigation process is that underlying bit of confidentiality. So both the person bringing the complaint forward, as well as the respondents, the person that the complaint is against, they can choose to waive their confidentiality or maintain their confidentiality throughout the process. One of the reasons and rationales for that is it's an eye to resolve the issue so it doesn't happen again. It doesn't really give the person that's brought the complaint forward their day in court to see where the resolution is. If a document's being heavily redacted to the point where the committee doesn't even know where to start the discussion, you might be able to refer it back to the investigator and say, or the employer if they're the ones redacting, we're entitled to the information in order to assess the recommendations and make our own recommendations. If they don't have the information to do that, they need to go to the employer. They need to get the investigator to get that. And my hope is that now that the wording around confidentiality, the wording around what should be in the investigator's report has been more clearly identified, I'm hoping those kind of circumstances are less frequent.
Thanks, Clint. Here's a quick question. When you refer to a new employee, does this mean hired after January 1st, 2021?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, and then just as a reminder, every employee must be trained by the end of the year. And that's training, not awareness.
Okay, thanks. How will an employer's failure to address harassment be addressed in the context of these changes?
Say that again, sorry?
How will the employer's failure to address harassment be addressed in the context of these changes?
So there's a couple different ways that'll happen. One is so what should be happening is an investigator should be looking at the entire situation, not just the incident itself, but also evaluating the employer's response and actions to that point. So that's why one of the benefits of having somebody from the outside looking in as an investigator to address some of those, inherent cultural systemic issues that are pervasive in a lot of our workplaces. So that's the first place that I would suggest that there's some remedy and looking into it further. And then as well, the internal complaint resolution process, going through the committee, going through the health and safety officer for direction or orders should provide clarity if you've got an employer that doesn't abide by the legislation or the IPGs as they stand right now. What I'm hoping is that a lot of those circumstances where the employer tried to slough off their duties and not address violence and harassment in the workplace, my hope is this new language has closed some of those loopholes that the employer had been trying to take advantage of, and the ambiguities in the language, those sorts of things. So one of the things I always recommend, like if you're an investigator and you're union representative helping somebody that's bringing a complaint forward, for example, make sure in the complaint you're capturing the employer's reaction as well, what they did, what they didn't do, their response. If there was any bias, if there was any responses that you didn't agree with, make sure that's captured in the complaint going forward for the investigator to consider.
Perfect. So will the investigator most likely be someone from labor relations?
No, it can't be. A short answer. So there's two different processes. One is from that predetermined list that involves both union and employer representative that's jointly created. That's the starting point. If if the parties involved can't agree on somebody from that list, then somebody from labor programs would act as the investigator.
Okay. Are there timelines for the employer to share the report? The investigation report, sorry.
Yep. So it really depends on, you know, what has gone on to that point. So by 45 days, the employer has to come forward and have made it and begin efforts to resolve the issue before it goes to mediation, before it goes to an investigator. If it's not resolved after that 45-day timeline for the employer, then it gets a little bit dicier, where there's a 60-day timeline to appoint an investigator. And then depending on the amount of time the investigator needs, those sorts of things, the time for them to create the report, get that report to the committee, and then implement all of the recommendations that went forward, there's a 1-year timeline for that. So it's the timelines are there, but it's kind of ambiguous and open to, you know, to flexibility depending on how the issue itself resolves. Like if you take that mediation step into consideration, those sorts of things, that can extend the time, obviously, if you're adding in that extra step.
Okay, I see we're getting almost to the end. I'm gonna read one more because there are lots of questions here, and you can tell me if you want to keep going for a few minutes.
Well, maybe just in consideration of time, we'll hit 2 more, and then what I would suggest is if anybody has any questions that weren't addressed, that you feel you really needed an answer to, on the screen there, you've got my phone number, my office phone number, and my work email. So shoot me a quick message. I'll do my best to address any concerns that we don't address in the when we're wrapping up. What I'll also refer to is in the handout section. There's a couple handouts there. If I can, I'll see if I can open them up here. So the first one is that the IPG, 45 pages. A lot of the answers that we didn't cover here, my guess is the majority are going to be found clearly outlined in this IPG. Next one is going to be a flow chart. So PSAC created flow chart that outlines the steps that you can follow in the investigation process to resolve an issue of workplace violence. And the last one that I've attached is just a workplace electronic poster that you can distribute in the workplace, distribute through email. That's a little more generic, but if anybody has questions about looking for resources, anything like that, the CCOHS that's at the bottom of the poster there, fabulous organization for additional materials, posters, training sessions. They're, you know, like if your workplace is looking for training opportunities, my first place I'd look is what's offered by the CCOHS. So my suggestion would be even some of the questions, even if we haven't covered here, you're going to find in some of those resources and handouts that we have available.
Are you done?
Yeah, I'm done now. Sorry. If you haven't noticed by now, and I kind of ramble on, or my mind says, "Oh, I got to mention this," and just...
I'm waiting for the appropriate pause. Okay, sorry, folks.
Pause. Yeah.
This is what happens when we don't work face to face every day.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a really interesting question. Do you see this process taking over from the grievance process due to the defined timelines, as grievance decisions are taking years to resolve?
No, I don't see it overtaking the grievance process, but I think they can work in conjunction. The grievance process is really good if there's clear collective agreement language. It's really good if there's any sort of remedy required, such as a loss of salary, compensation, penalties, those sorts of things. That's where the grievance process is going to be beneficial. And we need to remember that this process, it's with an eye to prevention. It's not a punitive for the employer or holding the employer accountable. It's with an eye of learning from the circumstances and what's been reported and ensuring that it doesn't happen again. So those two processes can work in tandem and they each have their benefits. Like grievance process has those clearly identified timelines. If there's clear collective agreement language, that's really helpful. But the investigation process is really helpful because it gets somebody from the outside looking in, looking at the culture of the workplace, looking at all those contributing factors that contributed to the violence in the workplace, and providing recommendations. Grievances are also, preferred by a lot of locals and a lot of components, simply because that's the process that locals and components are used to, as well as the format that employers are used to receiving these sorts of complaints from. When we talk about, the investigation, those sorts of things, we really need to be cognizant of that. And then I think a lot of people aren't aware of the ins and outs of this whole investigative process, so they don't understand the full capabilities of it and defer back to what they know, which is the grievance process, which is fine. But what we also want to do, starting with this session, is expanding our knowledge, our knowledge of the legislation that's out there that supports what we need to do to get the help to our members that need that help. There's more than one tool in the toolbox, I guess is the short answer. I'm done.
Okay, and the last question, and folks, for those of you whose questions did not get answered, we're going to send the written report to Clint, or you can email him like he said, but we can keep a record of the questions that weren't answered. And I'm making a note of who actually did get a response. So the last question of the night is, does the complaint have to go through the union to the employer?
No, the complaint can come from anywhere. It can come from an employee that's not directly affected. It can come from the employee that's directly affected. One of the areas where the old language of this legislation wasn't really good on is the role of the union. We didn't really talk about it in our presentation, but that's been expanded in the new language as well, where it clarifies the role of the union representative in the process and the role that they would play. So it doesn't have to come from the union. It might come from the union, the example I always use when I do the education is it could be written on a brick for all I care. As long as the employer's been made aware of the situation, that's the trigger for the employer's responsibility to start. That's the trigger for all these other processes of resolution, mediation, investigation to start. And I always reference brick because I wrote a grievance on a brick once when I was pissed off at the employer. So.
Thank you, Clint. Thank you very much, Martha, for your asking of the questions. Much appreciated. And also commented in a lot of the questions. I was looking through them as well. Clint has many thanks for the presentation. People found it very informative. So there's lots of thanks, Clint. Thanks, Clint. So I just wanted to share that. Before we kind of close off, I just wanted to touch base with Marianne to see if there's anything else that she wants to add or in kind of closing for tonight.
So before we give Marianne the last word, can I hop in? Because
Yeah.
I would like to give Marianne the last word. So just to remind people to look for the education that'll be coming up very shortly within the next month. We'll be offering out of HRO. Again, it'll be the 2-day course that more fully fleshes out all the topics that we've discussed in this short period of time, as well as some of those introductory health and safety courses that we'll be offering. As well, just a reminder, there's going to be a survey that pops up after. Be sure to fill it out. If there's webinar topics, health and safety related, you want to see in the future, that's your opportunity to let us know what you'd like to see going forward. And that's it. Thank you very much for the kind words. Hopefully I've, got your brain going a little bit on this topic and exploring, how you can use it to your benefit and those sorts of things. And we'll continue the conversation.
Perfect. Okay, so the only reason Clint likes to let me have the last word is because it gives him satisfaction to be able to hit the button and say end broadcast and cut me off. And I'm okay with that. We've been doing enough webinars that we have a system. And hey, if that's what makes Clint happy, oh, the cat's arrived. So no, I just want to say thank you. I mean, this is a piece of legislation that, the whole issue of violence and harassment under the old Part 20 was confusing and it didn't necessarily work. And, you know, we didn't get everything we wanted in the amendments. And actually, it's interesting because I was actually the representative in the ACON case when it first started. And we had no idea what we were doing. We were playing it by ear, but had really good support on that. So we've moved a lot, but it's still very confusing. And there's a lot of resistance in the department. So one of the things that is absolutely critical is do not accept what the employer tells you if you don't believe it to be right. And that's where you need to talk to your component, you need to talk to your local executive, you need to talk to your national officers, your RVP or your NVP, because if you're having issues at the local level, then, you know, there's calls that can be made up the chain. So very confusing, but you presented it really well. So thanks again, Clint, and thanks to Tracy and Martha for fielding the questions. And I'm sure we'll be back on a health and safety webinar soon.